Welcome back, everyone, to Voices of the Soul, where we take deep dives into all sorts of fascinating topics. Today, we're tackling something I think a lot of us have probably wondered about. What does it really mean when someone takes, like, forever to text you back?
Yeah, that's the million-dollar question, isn't it? Especially in the age of dating apps and instant messaging. It's like this whole new layer of complexity has been added to the whole dating game.
And it can drive you crazy sometimes, right? They're sitting there like, hello, it's today. So we're going to be digging into a Reddit thread today from the AskMenAdvice subreddit. And let me tell you, it's a juicy one.
Oh, those Ask Men Advice threads, they're always a gold mine.
Seriously. So in this thread, the original poster is basically convinced that delayed replies, especially from women, mean one thing and one thing only. She's just not that into you.
And as you can imagine, that sparked quite the debate.
Oh yeah, the comment section is on fire. But it's actually really fascinating to see all the different perspectives that come up.
It really highlights how differently people view communication and, what they consider to be acceptable response times.
Exactly. So to kick things off, the OP basically lays down this pretty rigid standard. He's like, if Elon Musk can run multiple companies and still find time to tweet, then a woman can absolutely make time to respond if she's actually interested.
Yeah.
I mean, it's a pretty bold statement, right?
It is, and it kind of sets the tone for a lot of the comments that follow.
Right. Like right out of the gate, you have comments like, ain't no one busier than a woman who is not interested.
And of course, you've got the classic, chase a check, never chase a check. It seems like a lot of the guys are taking this very, cut your losses approach.
There's definitely this no-nonsense vibe in a lot of the responses.
Yeah.
But then you also see that line that seems to pop up in almost every dating advice conversation. If she wanted to, she would.
That one always gets me thinking because it gets to the heart of assuming someone's intent based solely on their actions, or in this case, inaction.
Right. But is it really that black and white?
That's what we're going to unpack today.
Because believe me, as we dug deeper into this thread, things got a lot more nuanced and interesting. We even had busy professionals chiming in, lawyers, surgeons, entrepreneurs, all saying they make it a priority to respond to people they care about, even with their crazy schedules.
This is where we start to see that black and white thinking challenged, right? Suddenly, it's not as simple as assuming everyone who doesn't text back immediately is just not interested.
It makes you wonder, are we sometimes too quick to jump to conclusions about someone's interest level based solely on like how fast they respond to our messages?
It's definitely something to consider. I mean, we're all living in this hyper-connected world where instant communication is the norm. But maybe we need to step back and reevaluate our expectations a little bit.
For sure. And this is really just the tip of the iceberg. As we keep going through this thread, we're going to be diving into some personal anecdotes, counter-arguments, and even discussions about the double standards in dating advice for men versus women.
It's going to be a pretty insightful deep dive into the complexities of communication in the digital age, I think.
I think so too. But before we unpack all of that, I do want to quickly remind everyone to subscribe to Shauna Pelage on YouTube and like this video if you're finding this conversation helpful.
Yeah, it really does help us create more content like this for you guys.
Okay, back to the Reddit thread. One woman shared how she actually struggles with texting because of ADHD, but that doesn't mean she's not interested in the person she's talking to.
This is where things start to get really fascinating because it adds such an important layer of nuance to the whole conversation, right?
Absolutely. And it makes you
Yeah.
realize there are so many reasons why someone might not be texting back as quickly as you'd like. It's not always a sign of disinterest.
Exactly. And sometimes it has nothing to do with you at all. It really underscores the importance of, giving people the benefit of the doubt and not jumping to conclusions too quickly.
Totally. And it kind of ties into another interesting thread that emerged in the comments. It's about the conflicting advice that men and women often receive about dating.
Oh, yeah, that's a big one. Like, on the one hand, men are often told to be persistent, to not give up easily if a woman doesn't respond right away.
But then women are told not to come across as too eager or desperate.
Hmm.
It's like, how do you even reconcile those two things?
It does seem like a recipe for mixed signals and misunderstandings.
Right. And this Reddit thread actually highlighted those conflicting expectations in some pretty funny, well, maybe not funny, but definitely eye-opening ways.
Yeah. Can you give us an example?
Sure. So one guy shared a story about dating this thoracic surgeon. Initially, she was texting him all the time, like nonstop. But then after the second date, poof, communication just dropped off.
That's so interesting because it speaks to the difference between initial enthusiasm and sustained interest. Maybe that early spark just fizzled out and her texting habits reflected that.
Yeah, maybe. And then there was this other story about a woman who left a guy on read for 8 days. 8 days.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, and her excuse was that she was, quote unquote, out of town. But supposedly she really cared about him.
That's where it gets tricky, right? Like, at what point does a delayed response cross the line from just being busy to actually being a sign of something more?
It's the question that haunts us all, isn't it? But this is where I think the idea of individual communication styles comes back into play.
Absolutely.
For
Because what might feel disrespectful or dismissive to one person could be completely normal for someone else.
So how do you navigate that, especially when you're in those early stages of dating and trying to figure out if someone's genuinely interested or not?
It's a tough one for sure. But, I mean, this Reddit thread did have a few interesting suggestions.
Oh, yeah. Like what?
Well, one commenter suggested giving out your number instead of asking for hers. So if she texts you, she's interested. If not, well, you saved yourself some potential heartache.
That's actually pretty smart. It puts the ball in her court and eliminates all the anxiety of waiting for her to text back.
Exactly. No more agonizing over response times or crafting the perfect message.
Right. No more overthinking those emojis. Just put yourself out there and see what happens.
And honestly, sometimes the silence itself can be a form of communication. It can give you a pretty clear indication of where you stand with someone.
It's true. But, beyond the whole individual communication styles thing, there were a lot of comments in the thread that just straight up said, look, sometimes she's just not that into you.
I mean, as much as it might sting to hear that, it's important to be realistic sometimes and, recognize when it's time to move on.
Yeah. Holding on to false hope or trying to read into every little text delay just leads to more heartache in the long run.
And it's not just women who do this. There were plenty of guys in the thread admitting to ghosting or breadcrumbing or whatever the latest dating term is.
It's definitely a human thing, not just a female thing. We've all been on both sides of that equation at some point.
Exactly. And that's why it's so important to have these conversations to understand that everyone has different perspectives and anxieties, especially when it comes to dating and communication in the digital age.
Totally. And speaking of conversations, don't forget to subscribe to Shauna Palaj on YouTube and give this video a like if you're enjoying this discussion so far.
Yeah, your support really means a lot to us.
Okay, so getting back to this Reddit thread, one commenter really hit the nail on the head when they said, an interested woman is never going to fully ignore you or take days to reply. But they also added, sadly, some people are going to read that as an interested woman needs to be instantly replying to any random bullshit.
Yeah, that's a really important distinction to make, right? There's a big difference between consistent communication and feeling like you need to be glued to your phone 24/7, right? And that balance can be really tough to find, especially in the digital age. But that's something we'll keep exploring as we continue this deep dive.
So as we wrap up our deep dive into this whole texting mystery, what really sticks out to you from all these different perspectives?
It really struck me how much anxiety we all seem to have around digital communication, especially when it comes to dating. It's like every unanswered text turns into this huge deal.
It's so true. We overthink everything. Like, what does that emoji really mean? Why hasn't he responded yet? Is it something I said?
It can be exhausting. And I think it often takes away from the fun of actually getting to know someone. We get so caught up in the whole game of texting that we kind of lose sight of the bigger picture.
I know. It's like we forget that real connection comes from, actual conversations and shared experiences, not just perfectly timed text messages.
Exactly. One of the most insightful comments I saw in that Reddit thread talked about how we're all speaking different love languages when it comes to communication.
Oh, that's such a good point. Just like we all give and receive love in different ways, we also communicate our interest and affection differently.
And those differences can lead to so much confusion, especially when you're trying to decipher someone's intentions through a screen.
Right. What one person might consider a clear sign of disinterest could just be someone else's way of saying, hey, I'm busy, but I'm still thinking about you.
Exactly. So, how do we navigate all of this? How do we balance showing interest with respecting boundaries in a world where we're expected to be constantly connected?
It's tough. Any advice for our listeners?
Well, I think self-awareness is key. Understanding our own communication style and what we need from the other person is so important.
And not being afraid to actually communicate those needs.
Yeah.
Right? Instead of just expecting the other person to magically read our minds.
Right. It all comes back to good old-fashioned communication,
Mhm.
being open, honest, and vulnerable.
I love that. Well said. On that note, I want to thank everyone for joining us on this deep dive into the sometimes confusing world of modern dating.
We hope you found it insightful and maybe even a little bit reassuring.
And if you did, we'd love it if you'd subscribe to Shauna Plage on YouTube and give this video a like.
It really does help us keep creating more deep dives like this for you guys.
And as always, feel free to share your own thoughts and experiences in the comments below. We love hearing from you.
Until next time, keep those conversations flowing, both online and offline.
And remember, sometimes the most meaningful connections happen when we put down our phones and just engage with the world around us.